On this episode of TTS Talks, host Jim Semivan is joined by authors Peter Lavenda and A.J. Hartley for a fascinating conversation about hidden history, the occult, and how sinister forces in Time Rider connect conspiracy, power, and the mysteries that shape our reality.
Hi, I'm Jim Semivan, and welcome to episode 16 of the TTS Talks podcast. Today we have two very special guests, authors Peter Lavenda and A.J. Hartley. Peter will be discussing the 20th anniversary reissue of his classic nonfiction trilogy, Sinister Forces. And A.J. will be discussing his new novel, to the extent that he can, Time Rider, which picks up some of the themes in Peter's Sinister Forces and reimagines them into a thrilling and really rather high-octane story of time travel and the perils of authoritarianism. And for those of you not familiar with TTS Talks, this is a podcast where we take a deep dive into the complexities of our mission here at To the Stars by bringing you one-on-one conversations with the various people who are helping us achieve our goals and give life to our projects here at To the Stars. Andrew James A.J. Hartley is a renowned British-born American novelist, academic, playwright, and dramaturge. He is also known under the pen name Andrew Hart, particularly for his adult thrillers. A.J. earned his master's degree and doctorate in English literature from Boston University before embarking on a distinguished academic career. Before his recent retirement, A.J. held the position of Robinson Distinguished Professor of Shakespeare Studies in the Department of Theater and Dance at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He also directed the Shakespeare and Action Center and edited the performance journal Shakespeare Bulletin for Johns Hopkins University Press for over a decade. A.J. is an award-winning and New York Times best-selling author, writing across multiple genres, such as mystery, thriller, fantasy, historical fiction, and young adult novels. He has notably penned series like the Thomas Knight archaeological thrillers and the young adult-focused Hawthorne Saga. His middle-grade fantasy adventures include the Darren Arkwright series, while its much-acclaimed young adult saga Steeplejack earned a place on Kirkus's Best Teen Books of 2016 and won multiple awards, including the Manly Wade Wellman and International Thriller Writers Young Adult Awards. Other standout works include Cold Bath Street, one of my favorites, long listed for the Carnegie Medal, and Impervious, a fantasy novel inspired by Hartley's own experience surviving a university campus shooting. A.J. is also known for his Hideki Smith novels, which grew out of his long engagement with Japan, including, had its features on its YouTube channel, Japanese rock music. With our own Tom DeLonge, A.J. wrote the Secret Machines fiction series, Cathedrals of Glass series, which include Planets of Blood and Ice, and the most recent young adult thriller, Trinity, another great one in 2024. And Peter Lavenda has once again found the time in his own busy schedule to sit down with A.J. and myself to discuss this much-awaited reissuing of his master trilogy, Sinister Forces. Peter is also a prolific writer, widely recognized for his work in occult history and esoteric studies. He was born in the Bronx, grew up in various parts of the U.S., including Indiana, Chicago, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. He holds a master's degree in religious studies and Asian studies from Florida International University and worked as an executive for a U.S. telecom company, spending over 7 years in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Peter was also among the first Americans to conduct business in a post-normalized China. Peter is an expert in occult history, and his work primarily examines the intersections of politics, religion, and occultism. His most famous book is Unholy Alliance, A History of Nazi Involvement with the Occult. That was an eye-opener for me. It was published in 1994. And that explores the history of the esoteric roots of Nazi ideology. Peter has authored or co-authored a diverse array of books, including Dead Names, The Dark History of the Necronomicon. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Peter. The Sinister Forces series, of course. The Secret Temple, Mason's Mysteries in the Founding of America in 2009. Ratline, another one of my favorites. Soviet Spies, Nazi Priests, The Disappearance of Adolf Hitler. The Angel and the Sorcerer. The Dark Lord. H.P. Lovecraft, Kenneth Grant in a Typhonian Tradition in Magic, and numerous fiction works, including the Lovecraft trilogy. Peter has appeared as an expert on the History Channel, Discovery Channel, National Geographic, and TNT, and has offered commentary and insights into Nazi esotericism and extreme ideological currents. He has interviewed neo-Nazis, Klansmen, cult spies, and extremists. I should also add that Peter's work has been lauded by such luminaries and disparate figures as Norman Mailer and William Burroughs. Peter, AJ, once again, thank you much for being here today. It's a real treat for me, and I'm sure for our listeners. I'm Jim Semivan, co-founder of TTS and Vice President of Operations, and your host today. So, gentlemen, let's get into the conversation. There is a lot to discuss. Peter, I want to start with you, if that's all right. Sinister Forces, generally speaking, is an exploration of the role the occult plays in American history. In these books, you trace elements of the occult from the pre-colonial period to the modern era. The CIA mind control programs, the enigma of the Nine, and we'll get into that a little bit later, who the Nine are or were, the Kennedy assassination, and counterculture figure Charles Manson. They all play prominent roles in Sinister Forces. It's a rather disturbing series, at least for me, in that it is a narrative of uncanny historical and thematic correspondences that most historians seem to have either ignored or were or are unable to explain. Now, in your book, you note that Sinister Forces is meant to show the connection between the paranormal and the synchronistic, which, as you noted, is at the heart of the entire 3-volume study. It's pretty heady stuff. So let me throw some questions at you, Peter, right off. What were the circumstances that prompted you to write Sinister Forces? Was it the promise of uncovering conspiracy or exposing a serious cultural history with occult overtones? And is Sinister Forces arguing that occult forces are literally at work or that they function as metaphors for hidden power? Sorry for all those questions jammed into one, but...
Oh, I'll answer the third one first, the second one second, and then I don't know. Yeah. Basically speaking, I got into it because of Watergate. It's as simple as that. I mean, I grew up in the 1950s and 1960s with the McCarthy era and the threat of nuclear holocaust and all of that, and air raid drills and hiding under your desk at school, kissing your ass goodbye, all of that stuff. And then it was the Kennedy assassination, which I don't have an alibi. I was 13 years old. I stayed home from school that day. So when I went back to school the next week, everybody's looking at me strangely, like, where were you? But there was this idea that there was something strange. When Kennedy was shot, my mother came into my bedroom and said, "They've shot the president," right? That was the expression that she used, "They have shot the president." It was this idea of this they, this kind of editorial they instead of an editorial we. And it's like, who's they? This was planted immediately. They shot the president. And okay, so I go through a lot of my adventures in the 1960s, which turned out to be connected to peripheral characters in the assassination, like David Ferrie and Jack Martin, because of my weird religious adventures of 1967, 68, and 69, when a friend of mine and I were desperately trying to stay out of Vietnam and created a church, figuring that if we had ministerial deferments, they couldn't draft us, which was true legally. And we said, well, we don't want to actually join a real church because that's too much work.
Right.
And the whole celibacy thing, being brought up Catholic, is like, what are you going to do? So we hit upon this idea of an Eastern Orthodox church, like a Russian Orthodox or a Greek Orthodox church. They had married priests anyway, so that seemed a little safer. And we're both have Czechoslovak backgrounds, my friend and I. So there wasn't a Czechoslovak Orthodox church in the United States, at least not that we could find. So we invented it. And we created it, and we had adult people sign the papers to incorporate it. And so we had this church. This is a long way around, but what I'm leading up to is the fact that we were discovered by a Ukrainian Orthodox denomination that brought us in, like under their protection in a sense. It's a long story, but it turned out this church was a front and for other operations. And two of its most prominent members were Jack Martin and David Ferrie, people that were considered to be co-conspirators in the Kennedy assassination, at least from the point of view of the district attorney of New Orleans, right? So there was this idea that they made the movie JFK, Kevin Costner and all of that. So Jack Martin and David Ferrie were two important characters in New Orleans who had known Oswald, supposedly, and were also members of this church. So all these things, they were in the back of my mind when Watergate happens. And when Watergate happens, I was fascinated. I read 3 newspapers a day. I read in New York City. So it was the Times, the Post, and the Daily News. I read them all. And then I read whatever else was available. I didn't watch television. For 10 years, I didn't own a television, didn't watch it. But I read a lot of newspapers, and I started clipping articles because names started popping out, and they all started looking familiar. So finally, there was the famous 18-and-a-half-minute Oval Office gap, right? Nixon was taping his meetings in the Oval Office all around Watergate, all around that conspiracy. And he taped all of his meetings, except for the one crucial tape was missing 18-and-a-half minutes. And I remember it was I think it was the chief of staff at the time said the 18-and-a-half-minute tape gap was due to sinister forces. Which, well, this is rich. What the hell does that mean, right? That is such like sinister forces. Does that mean people? Does that mean like witches? What does it mean, sinister forces? So that got me off and running. And then the Village Voice had a series of articles called Patriotic Witchcraft. And it pointed at some of the synchronicities and coincidences around Watergate, around Nixon, around when he quit, when he abdicated, let's say, the presidency, and a lot of connective tissue between that and Charles Manson and a lot of other stuff that really didn't make sense at the time, but in that context looked really weird. So I decided at that point I'm going to start researching this. I want to know what relationship religious and weird spiritual beliefs have on politics. What is that interconnection? Because there seemed to be a lot of religion going on with all this stuff. I mean, the weird churches, that Jim Garrison, the DA of New Orleans, couldn't figure out. So he didn't know what the role was of the churches. And I eventually got copies of his correspondence with the Senate subcommittee back in the 70s that was reopening those investigations. And he wrote to them and said, listen, man, look at these weird churches. I have no idea what the connection is, but they're all over the place. So I had this weird accident in my life that I had a front row seat to the weird churches involved with that stuff going on in New Orleans. And that sort of forced me to look at this, right? I couldn't just walk away. I had to know what was that. And was I peripheral to this in some way, right? As a kid. Yeah. I was 13 years old when Kennedy was assassinated. Obviously, I didn't have much input to that. And I was only 17 or 18 when we got involved with these weird churches. But I was there. I saw people coming in and out. I saw the feds coming in and out. I saw strange people from foreign countries come in to become bishops and then the next day leave and go to some foreign locale where they got involved with some other daring do. So all of this made me really focus on it. And I started with the Nazis. And you mentioned Unholy Alliance. I started with the Nazis. And I said, there's an obvious example. There's Nazis, and it was the swastika and all this strange religious shit going on with the Nazis. So I said, let me start there. And Unholy Alliance was supposed to be one chapter of Sinister Forces, but it started to grow exponentially. And I spent 20, 25 years researching it. I just had mountains of paper and newspaper articles, and all of this was before internet, right? So I'm building all of these documents, all of these files. I'm going to libraries, going to archives. I spent a lot of time at the National Archives in DC and in the Library of Congress and all over the place. I started traveling, going around the world and collecting information. So that started Sinister Forces. It was very simply, I had this strange experience when I was a teenager, and it made me see that there were these weird connections that I didn't realize existed. Growing up as a Catholic in Catholic school in the 1950s and 60s, you just didn't realize there was this whole other world that was going on with fake bishops, spies or intelligence people posing as bishops or as priests, and churches without congregations, right? All of these guys, they have all of these roles, all of these titles, and there's absolutely no congregation. There's nothing, right? Usually no building, there's nothing. And yet they have all these titles and documents and papers. And what is that all about? What are these document mills all about? And that just leads you down other avenues. And so it got crazy, and Sinister Forces is the result of that, Jim, to answer your simple question in a long, involved, and convoluted way, as is my want.
Yeah, no, I think you did an excellent job. And, when I finished all 3 a while back, I read them not quite when they came out, a little afterwards when they came out. And AJ, you grew up in Britain, am I correct?
Yes.
Did you see these kind of synchronicities going on, or was a distinguished professor of Shakespeare studies? You must have seen the connections between, I know, some of the occult stuff that was going on in that period of time and what have you. Is that something that you ever considered or thought about?
Yeah, I think obviously the more you dig into the period in which literature is produced, the more you discover how fragmented it is, right? That there's an assumption that the past is somehow univocal, that there's a set of beliefs that people had. And that's simply not the case. There's all kinds of competing ideologies and belief systems. And the early modern period, the late 15th, early 16th century, and late 16th, early 17th century, as far as Shakespeare is concerned, is rife with religious shifts and confusions and parallel denominations, which is a comparatively new thing in England. But it's also rife with mysticism, some of which is derived from older Catholic forms as the country shifts into various forms of Protestantism, but also into magic. And these things inform a lot of the plays, Shakespeare's plays, that are full of, think of fairies.
This will be a great example, right?
And Tempest, obviously, with Prospero as the sort of a certain kind of white magician, but also the witchcraft in Macbeth. And none of these things are incidental. They're all things that people actively believed in the period, right? And have connections. King James had direct connections to issues of witchcraft. So these were things that were very much in the mindset of the people. They weren't just made up. It wasn't fantasy. And of course, a lot of prominent people involved in some of these court factions under Elizabeth who were experimenting with certain kinds of magic and stuff were politically incredibly powerful people, and connections to Christopher Marlowe, who was an alleged spy in the time, and all that. So there's a lot going on. And I think when I was reading Peter's work, there's a sense that maybe the tradition is different, maybe the particular manifestation is different, but yeah, it all looked weirdly familiar to me.
Yeah, that's interesting. Peter, you also mentioned in book one that the trilogy is an attempt at understanding. And you posited that, like some physicists and psychoanalysts have done in the past, that there just may be another mechanism in the universe that binds together events seemingly unrelated. And A.J., you also explore a similar idea in Time Raider, your new book. I want you both to comment on it a little bit, because what I'm a little not confused by, Peter, is, are you saying that there's like a hidden history or a sort of an occult leitmotif that's running through our own history?
Well, the problem is we have to kind of define our terms here, because that's where it gets dangerous. When you start talking about a hidden history, there's this implication that there's a bunch of people pulling strings. And I'm not sure that's the case, right? I think that we don't really understand our own reality well enough to be able to understand how events happen and how people can influence the events and be influenced by them. So we want to believe there's a deep state, right? We want to believe that there's these guys smoking cigars in a back room, is the analogy I always use, right? That are plotting all this stuff, or it's the eyes wide shut, it's a bunch of cultists in a wealthy man's mansion sitting there and pulling the strings. It's not quite that cut and dry, not quite that simple. I think these people do exist. People like that exist. Stuff like that exists, but that's not the whole story. And things happen in life that are obviously, we have a kind of pareidolia about it, right? We see things that are going on and we try to make sense of it and build a narrative around it where maybe none exists. But at the same time, there are levels of experience we're not consciously aware of that take place. And it's that level of experience that we tend to lump in with everything else. So we're confused by our own reality to the point where things really happen, dramatic things happen. We're looking for immediate answers. We're looking for an immediate rationale for it. And I think in Sinister Forces, what I was trying to do was say, look at this weird stuff. Look at this. This doesn't make any sense. If you look at it from the point of a narrative, if you were writing this as a story, people would say, oh, come on, stop it, right? Because it's just too outlandish. And yet the facts are there. And you can have this sort of looking at the clouds and seeing the face of Shakespeare or seeing the face of a little fuzzy cat. It doesn't matter. It's the same clouds. But it's what you're bringing to the table. So when you're investigating something like this, and like what I did, I started amassing all these documents, and I really value the primary sources over everything else. I said, let me look at the stuff. Let me look at the real stuff, right? And if somebody mentions in passing a book or a movie or something that's not really germane to that particular subject, what are they trying to say? Is that like a tell? Is that a subconscious tell? Are they telling us something that we have to look further? So as an example, Bluebird, right? CIA, the very first mind control operation, 1950. And they're scared to death of the North Koreans and the Chinese and the Russians. They have some weird ability to erase men's minds and replace consciousness with something else. This is what the belief was, brainwashing. So they called it Bluebird. Now that right away to me is a tell. And I'm looking at this and I'm saying, why the hell did they call it Bluebird? What was the rationale for Bluebird? Why that name for the secret operation of mind control? And so that led me to research Bluebird, and it was a famous play by this Belgian mystic who won the Nobel Prize. And it was called The Bluebird and the Bluebird of Happiness, and these two little children looking out for the Bluebird of Happiness and going through all these adventures. If you read that play, it's bizarre. It's like Alice in Wonderland, but a little darker, if you could imagine. And then I thought, okay, well, that's interesting. And as I'm looking at this book, I found it in a library in Westerly, Rhode Island. And there's this old book, right? And there's the Bluebird play. Great. And the next play after it, by the same author, Maurice Maeterlinck, is The Cloud That Lifted. Never been performed in this country as far as I know. I don't know if it was ever performed overseas. But there's the whole play, and I'm reading it, and I'm thinking, this is about an assassination that takes place with some mystery surrounding it. A king is murdered, is assassinated by gunfire. The shots are coming from a park in front of him. We don't know how many shots are fired. It was mysterious. Was it 3 shots? Was it 4 shots? The assassin is caught, but they think he's working for Russia, but they're not sure. And his name is Alec. And Alec was Lee Harvey Oswald's name in Minsk. And it was the name that he ordered the Mannlicher Carcano under, Alec Heidel. And I'm thinking, this play was written before Kennedy was even born. But there's the whole scenario. There's the king. He's walking down the street with his entourage. Somebody fires at him from a grassy knoll. His name is Alec, and maybe he's working for the Russians. We don't know. So when I see that, and I think to myself, well, I can't ignore it, right? I can't just say, oh, that's interesting, and drop it, because that's what everybody else would do. That's what a regular historian would do. There's no connective tissue here, right? I can't prove there's a relationship, so ignore it. So does that mean that Kennedy's assassination was planned by the same people who created Operation Bluebird, that they read the same book, right? Doesn't make sense. So what does make sense? That there's something else. There's a sinister force, right? Operating somehow below the level of consciousness. And it's a field of some kind. It just operates that way. It knows when things are going to happen decades before, or perhaps centuries before, right? It's there. It's the time writer concept without blowing too much away. I don't want to step on A.J.'s situation here. But there's this time difference thing. How can people know ahead of time? There was the Texas Tower sniper, right? 1966, I think, right? Here's the guy who goes up to the top of the Texas Tower and he shoots a bunch of people, kills a lot of people. And he's finally shot by a police captain, the local police captain in Austin, Texas. Okay, very famous case. But years before, a novel had been written that laid out all of those circumstances, completely the same, and even got the name of the police captain right. The guy who shot the actual sniper was a Captain Miles, and he got that right. He got it all right in this novel written years before it actually happened. Right? So when these things happen, you can't just say, well, there's no scientific reason for it, so let's ignore it. My emphasis was put all this in the book, put all this there, make people think, make people aware that perhaps there's something else at work in society. Maybe we have to be sensitive to it. Maybe the occultists had a better angle on it, and the witches and the wizards and the shamans. Maybe they have a better angle on it because they're looking at reality from a completely different perspective. They have a different way of looking at it. They're jumping over an obstacle somewhere and they're seeing something else and they're playing with it, they're manipulating it to the extent that they can. So what does our history mean? Is there something else taking place? I don't mean a devil manipulating things or pulling strings, just a force, just a sinister force. It may not even be sinister, but from our point of view, it is a sinister force that's out there running things, that's manipulating things, or is at least it's a force field that we have to take into consideration when we look at reality.
Yeah. That's fascinating. I'll just throw a little point of interest in here. It used to be in the old days in the intelligence community, even in the military, that you would, when you named a project, you would name it something that was related to what you were doing. It got to the point where the press got very good at finding things out. We call them cryptonyms. And so then there was, I think it was started in the 90s, there's this rule that it can't have anything to do, whatever hell you're going to name it, it can't have anything to do with what you're actually doing. So I know the military now just chooses these random names and puts them together and what have you. That's what's sort of scary and disturbing about your book. And A.J., in Sinister Forces, Peter writes about these group of elite scientists and occultists who channeled extraterrestrial intelligences. And in Time Writer, and I don't want to get too deep into, because your book hasn't come out yet. It'll be coming out soon, I understand, maybe next month. There's this group called the Nine that Peter talks about, and they contact astral forces through a particular person, and there's seance. They have a seance, and it goes between science, philosophy, and religion, sometimes dwelling on occult mysticism, and they're drawing on different cultural histories, sometimes talking relativity and quantum mechanics, sometimes dealing in feel-good platitudes about harmony and being one with the world and what have you. And I don't want to steal Peter's thunder, but can you explain the Nine to our listeners, why you included that in Time Writer, or do you prefer to skip this question completely?
I don't know that I can explain the Nine, but I can tell you who they are.
Okay.
And Peter, feel free to jump in at any point. So there's Dr. Andrea Puharich, Henry Jackson, Georgia Jackson, Alice Bovary, Marcella DuPont, Carl Betts, Vonnie Beck, Arthur Young, and Ruth Forbes Young. Some of those names may be familiar to some of your listeners. And what it amounts to is, in simple terms, a group of incredibly powerful, well-connected people who are all in this same space at this one time as part of a very odd quasi-magical experience in which they are supposedly in communication with some sort of astral force which is being channeled by a mystic of some sort. And I think in plot terms, in historical terms, part of the larger point, of course, is to underscore, as Peter has just been saying, the centrality of some of these sort of strange mystical convergences within the sort of economic and political elite of the country, right? For me as a novelist, of course, it's simply great because it's weird. And weird will carry you a long way. Because obviously the book has to work on a number of different levels, and some of it is about presenting truths of some kind, whether those are historical truths or human truths or mystical truths or whatever. And some of it is about creating the right atmospherics, the right tonality, right? You were saying that you read the book very quickly, that it was a page turner, and that it was hopefully fun. And part of what makes it fun, I think, is building the right circumstances and sense of strangeness. And one of the great things about working with Peter's stuff is that he doesn't, as he was saying, he doesn't lay out this equals this, this means this, and here's a progression of fact that leads to a certain conclusion. Instead, and I think I used this metaphor in Time Writer, it's kind of like looking at the night sky and making constellations, making connections between stars from which images emerge, and seeing what those images generate, but also simply acknowledging the oddity of their connection, right? So for my purposes, the Nine have a couple of different functions. And one of them is about underscoring this sense of how interconnected certain incredibly powerful people are whose lives and decisions are affecting the whole country in really telling ways. while simultaneously reinforcing this sense that they believe, or they seem to believe, that they are acting on some kind of spiritual mission, the purpose and nature of which is not entirely clear.
Yeah. Peter, why don't you jump in? But before you do, I think I recall during some discussions with some of our UAP friends, the idea, maybe it was you, Peter, with the idea that the Nine actually opened up a portal during some of their seances, because I remember it was the Collins elite that they say it's apocryphal, but I think it's real. A group of military people blamed the current UAP sightings, or the modern UAP sightings, on this particular group, the Nine, and I think on Crowley and some other people. But would you comment further on what AJ was talking about?
Yeah, I think AJ really set it up really well. And I'm really amazed that he rattled off all the names of the members of the Nine. It was practically in alphabetical order. It was great. Okay. I've never had anybody just sit there and go, well, this one. They'll stumble with Puharich and maybe get one other, but you got them all, babe. They're all. That's how deeply you're embedded in this stuff, AJ. You go out and have a drink or something, man, because that's just too focused.
By the way, I had dinner with Puharich's ex-wife about 2 weeks ago. Believe it or not. Yeah, honest to God. No kidding. Yeah. I don't want to give her name, but she's well.
Did you ask about the Nine?
No, I did not. I actually steer clear of that. It was a very acrimonious relationship, so I don't like to bring it up. I had to Peter
follow it up because I think I know who it is, but I won't.
I'll tell you later. Yeah, right.
I won't step on it, but yeah, okay. I think I know. Anyway, that's fascinating right there. There you go. There's the connection. Jim and the Nine.
Okay. Well, let me
one handshake away.
It's fine. She's an absolutely lovely person, by the way, but interestingly, she talked to me a lot when I had met her earlier about Puharich's relationship with Aberdeen Proving Grounds and these places regarding mind control, things along those lines. So, but Peter, one of the things both of you were discussing, you and AJ were discussing, were synchronicities, and I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about Carl Jung's idea regarding synchronicities and how you particularly depict it in Sinister Forces. And of course, AJ, do you also thematically consider the idea of synchronicities in Time Rider? Either one can go first.
Well, Peter, why don't you explain what it is first? Yeah.
Okay, well, synchronicity is like the new designation for coincidence, right? But it's a little deeper than that, because what happened was Carl Jung was in conversations with the physicist Wolfgang Pauli. And Pauli was actually undergoing a kind of therapy with Jung. He was analyzing dreams and everything else. Pauli was very depressed for a lot of reasons, and they were penetrating in all of this. But the idea of synchronicity kept coming up, that there would be a coincidence that they would be talking about something and something connected to that would happen, or there would be a dream and then something in waking life would reflect that dream. So we all know what synchronicity is, but from Jung's perspective, it was meaningful. This is a meaningful coincidence. This is not just two things that, wow, that's a coincidence. To Jung, it was meaningful. It meant something. It was a tell, like I said before. This was you had to probe it to figure out what the meaning might be. So synchronicity, and remember Pauli, I think he won the Nobel Prize for physics. This guy was a brilliant guy, but he was having visions that were sort of Gnostic in nature, and Jung was picking that up. He's having all these weird impressions and weird ideas, and a lot of his science may have come from this kind of an understanding that there was something he could not see. There was a force operating in the universe. There was a physical force in terms of physics, quantum physics perhaps, that's operating. And so that's the root of this idea that we have, that there's synchronicity, that there's meaningful coincidences, because if it's underneath the surface, but they pop up here and it pops up there, and one person is observing both of them, it does have meaning for that person. And a person outside of that will say, well, there's no meaning there, it's just a coincidence. But to the person experiencing it, it's extremely relevant, and it may actually help in Jungian style analysis and therapy, right? Because that's depth analysis. And what I used to like to tell people back in the day was that depth analysis is the passive approach to this material, whereas the occultist takes the active approach. The Jungian analysand is sitting there waiting for a dream to happen to give them some message, whereas the occultist takes this active approach, trying to create these synchronicities, trying to come up with a pattern of synchronicities that they can analyze, that they can even manipulate to a certain extent. So I don't know if that's going off the rails a little bit for you guys.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
And AJ, how about you in typewriter? Did you consider that at all?
Yeah, I think, okay, so the problem, right, and I think this is one of the differences between writing a novel and writing a book like Sinister Forces, is that at some point for the novel to make sense, the constellations do have to line up somehow. And this is less about the nature of the actual world and more about the logic of narrative causality. In other words, synchronicities that remain simply synchronicities, I can work with as thematics, I can work as echoes, I can work as symbolic connections. But if we're dealing with actual facts that appear in the story, at some point, the reader is going to want them to connect in specific ways. Okay. The relationship between the two things has to generate meaning. And I think that's one of the differences in the way that we both use these things, right? Because was the line from the Police song, it's many miles away, there's a shadow coming out of the lock, right? The thing about the song is about the father going to work and coming home, and each verse is paralleled with some kind of creature coming out of a monster on the other side of the country. And there's no apparent connection between those two things, but somehow they are related within the song. In a novel, at least in a non-postmodern abstract novel, at some point, there would need to be an explanation for how those two things come together. Otherwise, the reader's going to be like, wait, what? And it would be in some ways interesting to write that kind of book, but I want people to draw connections and to feel like they're coming to conclusions so that we don't have a situation like, say, the TV show Lost.
Right.
Where we were constantly being thrown new weirdnesses, which were clearly being invented on the spot and never contributed to the actual narrative evolution of the show. So we get to the end and they're like, yeah, most of that stuff is irrelevant and we don't know what to do with it. And I think within fiction, part of what fiction is, of course, is a structuring of reality, a way of giving life meaning that it normally doesn't have, right? So I need to find a way to draw on those synchronicities, but to then line them up and imply some kind of through line connection and consequence.
Yeah. Okay. Let me get a little bit more into Time Rider. There's a group of characters in Time Rider, and I try not to get too much detail, called the Alphas. And for the listener, the Alphas are this genetically altered super species that sort of taken control of a future Earth and exert enormous control over the general population. Society is divided up into distinct classes, and of course, they're the leaders, the Alphas. So I was curious about what your motivation for drawing these characters, and I say that in light of the fact that the characters themselves, how you describe them, resemble the Greys of UAP lore. Was that deliberate, or is that something I shouldn't even discuss? Yes, right.
It's deliberate, but I think it's the kind of thing that the story itself will answer that question. But yes. I think, that the Alphas are represented as pale and mostly hairless and cerebral and suspicious of bodies and labor and things that they consider in some ways lesser. As you said, it's a highly stratified society.
And you're describing me to a certain extent, but go ahead. Right.
The rigorous class system, but it's clear also that the class system is not simply social and economic, it's also racial, it's somehow genetic. And so this world of the future, we're talking about like 2157 is the year that the main character is living in at the start of the story, is a world that is, they say, the sort of pinnacle of human evolution. But the nature of that evolution is, initially at least, unclear and has been in some ways manipulated. And the mission that Bowie, that is our central character, is sent on is, he is told, to preserve their version of the present by going back into the past to prevent people from interfering with it. And this is a sort of classic time travel trope in some ways, though I think our take on it is a little bit different because we imagine multiple possible futures resulting from every action. So it's not, again, a linear thing. It can generate effectively multiple new universes. But yeah, the alphas represent, for want of a better term, the kind of evolution of a sort of Nazi ideology. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Peter, in book 2 of Sinister Forces, and I found these quotes very interesting to me. There's this theme that sinister forces were evoked by the American political, military, and intelligence leaders in the 20th century. And that one of the traces of this is, and I'm quoting you here, the support of Nazism by prominent Americans and the involvement in the occult and extremely bizarre religious practices and beliefs by still others. You also state, and I'm quoting here, this support of a heinous political and mystical philosophy was ongoing from the very end of World War II and has continued in one form or another through to the present day, thus contributing to a politico-occult malaise that has manifested in such atrocities as the Manson murders, revival of the Ku Klux Klan, and other racist organizations. AJ, this also seems to be a plot line in Time Runner too. And Peter, can you comment first on this? And then AJ, can you also comment on this in relationship to Time Runner, if you choose to do so?
Okay. Well, from my perspective, everything you just said is, yes, exactly. I still stand by all of that.
Okay.
When I say we, I mean we as Americans in general, we have short memories. And I think that the attraction for a lot of people in this country, where the Third Reich is concerned, where the Nazi regime is concerned, is that it was extremely energetic, extremely passionate, extremely focused. And there was a heavy supernatural element to it. There was the swastika alone. That's all that you had to know. Who does that, right? Can you imagine if a political party here came up with some weird occult symbol as their symbol? We have donkeys and elephants, big deal. They had a swastika, right? They were trying to make a statement, and then they started using runes, right? So the SS runes, the lightning bolt runes, right? The Zig runes, they call it. And they started doing all this stuff. This was paganism, neo-paganism. It was like a reinvented paganism. But it was also, with Heinrich Himmler, you had the Ahnenerbe, the SS division that really focused on mysticism and occultism and paganism and all this other stuff. There was the famous expedition to Tibet in 1938. You had all of this other stuff going on. You had the SS groups around the world digging in archaeological sites, trying to find evidence that there was an Aryan race that existed before the rest of the world. All this weird stuff was part of what made Nazism attractive to a lot of people, because there was this idea that there is a truth that we are not being told. That there's a hidden truth, there's a hidden mystery. And the Nazis were here flaunting it. Yes, we're going to dig into all those mysteries. We're going to see if our roots go back to Tibet, if the monks have special powers that can transform reality, all this other stuff that they were involved in. I wrote Unholy Alliance pretty much focused on that because I didn't believe it at first. You know, Morning of the Magicians introduced that concept.
Oh, yes.
And Morning was a great book. I loved it. When it first came out, I read it. And it was like mind-blowing stuff, but none of it was documented, virtually none of it. And so when I started to research my own work, I said, well, I've got to find the real documents, the real papers. Prove it that this existed, because I'm hoping that it didn't. I'm hoping I can ignore this as just somebody's fevered imagination. And then I was at the National Archives, and I walked in, and the archivist there, a very famous guy, Robert Wolf, he says, what are you looking for? And I told him, he says, oh, you want this stuff? And he leaves me over. And there's just drawers of microfilm of the Ahnenerbe and all of this stuff, the weird yoga poses they invented to mimic the runic forms and replacing Christmas and baptisms with pagan rituals and photographs of these. I can't ignore it now. Now I've got to include it. Now I've got to focus on it, actually. Yeah, I'm probably away from your initial question, what you were trying to get me to answer, but this interconnection between powerful groups and mysticism, it's not universal, but it is something that does attract a certain clientele, right? People who feel that there is something there that we can manipulate it, they're attracted. Jim, the CIA back in the day with all of their mind control stuff and Operation Often and Operation this and Operation that, and they were really going into all of this stuff, trying to figure out what's the key to the black box? How do we get into consciousness? How do we open that? How do we manipulate it? And you had the Memorial Institute in Montreal doing this weird stuff with depatterning and trying to replace memories with different memories, invented memories. Then you had CIA coming out and say, well, that's impossible, right? And then you had other CIA coming out saying, no, we did it. It was great. So you had all this stuff going on, all these people arguing about it. And you're thinking to yourself, oh my God, there is something to this. There are people invested in this. Did I trust Dick Helms saying, no, we dumped that program years ago? No, obviously. Why would they? Yeah. If it was working, if there was some progress being made, they would stick with it. And remote viewing, it falls into that category, and the LSD research and all that other stuff. So yeah, that stuff exists. And yes, people do get involved with it. And the Nazis, to me, represent that culmination of all the sickness that we could possibly imagine. All of the basest urges of a moderately educated person, not a really educated person, because critical thinking skills would enable them to look at this a little bit more sharply. But just the attraction, the allure that there may be something there. Kabbalah, for instance, numbers and letters have meanings. There's hidden meanings in the Bible. You can take it apart and look at it for hidden meanings. Right away, that opens up the can of worms, right? So the book I've been reading all this time isn't the real book, right? I've been reading a facsimile. There's something deeper and hidden within the text. That's all you need to know. There's a text and there's a hypertext. And there's a semiotext, and there's all this other levels of meaning in everything that you're doing. My God, I mean, you can go to town on that forever, and people do. So I think what happened is, at the end of World War II, we had communism, which was atheistic. And they said, religion is the opiate of the people and all that other stuff, misquoting, but still. So no religion here. I spent time in China. I spent decades doing China trade, and they didn't know what religion was. When I brought groups over here to the States, we went to St. Patrick's Cathedral once in New York, and all these cadres were following me into the church, and they're totally bewildered. What is the purpose of this building? Is it a meeting hall, right? They didn't know. I could not explain it to them. They had no way of knowing. Yeah. So you had that on one side, and you had the Nazis who hated Christianity and hated Judaism, but they were still occultists. They still had a fascination with the zig runes and the swastikas and all the rest of it, and the candlelight processions and all this other weird shit, the Nuremberg rallies and all of this. This was their life, right? The black uniforms, the death's head symbols, the Totenkopfring of the SS. This was not just politics by any stretch of the imagination. This was an extreme form of politics. And that's what always interested me, extreme politics and extreme religion. Where do these roads lead? And they lead diverge. Right? And that's what happened here. And we brought the Nazis in and we gave them carte blanche eventually. We got rid of Oppenheimer. We got rid of Parsons. We got rid of all the guys who helped develop the Jet Propulsion Lab. We called them communists. We fired them. We took away their security clearances. Even Oppenheimer, right? Even Oppenheimer lost a security clearance. But all the Nazis, we came in and gave them keys to the kingdom. Right?
I know.
Our enemies, the ones who tried to kill us, we gave them the keys to the kingdom. Why? Because communism. Yeah. And we continued to protect them because communism. So there was this Manichaean struggle, light and darkness, them and us, and nothing else mattered.
I mean, it changes, doesn't it? Right? It just changes very quickly. Yeah, that's the more and more I read about Paperclip, and particularly Werner von Braun, that's a whole nother show. AJ, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think, as Peter suggests, I'm fascinated by the appeal of this stuff and the impulse to play dress up and to believe you're part of an elite with secret knowledge and secret insight and core truths that other people don't understand. And I think this is part of the appeal of these kind of extreme occult and Nazi societies of one kind or another. And to come back to Time Rider is something that I've said a number of times. If I'm writing sci-fi or fantasy, I'm always writing about the present. That I'm not particularly interested in writing fiction that has no grounding in the reality in which I live. So yeah, some of my preoccupation with the rise of this totalitarian future is very much about where we are and what seems to appeal to people. And it's that, and again, as Peter says, that sense of secret knowledge and rightness, and particularly for people who have been, in some ways, they feel that they have not been given what they feel they deserve.
Right.
A certain kind of entitlement, and this belief system and power structure recenters them at the expense of other people. And that for some people is very appealing, and in ways that some people would probably not admit, but they like to see it. And then you get, with that sense of specialness, a particular sense of belonging. When Peter's talking about the uniforms and the rallies and the torchlight and all the rest of it, and this is part of the appeal of religion, right? I was raised Catholic too. I know what it was like as a child to be part of these big, highly theatrical liturgical events, and this sense of magic and belonging and identity, I think, is very powerful.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. Peter, let me throw it back to you. In book 3, Sinister Forces, you mentioned a doctrine of correspondences, which has always fascinated me, and which assumes that everything in reality is somehow linked to everything else in some way, and that the microcosmic world is a perfect image of the macrocosmic world. And if we can cause a change to occur in the microcosm, it will reflect in a corresponding change in the macrocosm. Can you explain some of this? Is the butterfly effect, is it? Or is this something totally different?
Well, the butterfly effect could be seen as an expression of it, but it's not the whole story. The doctrine of correspondences is essential basically to virtually every magical type of operation, no matter where you find it in the world. And that is that if I affect something in this world, it's going to make a change in the other world, which is then going to affect this world again. This is this boomerang effect, right? So we look for a correspondence. The sunflower is a perfect example. So a sunflower looks like the sun, therefore it has the qualities of the sun. Therefore, if I want to avoid the dangers of a solar eclipse, I have to do something with the sunflower, which is going to protect me against whatever evil comes out of the solar eclipse. It's this idea that there's this connection. And of course, that's a simplistic example, but it goes much deeper than that. So it gets to the planets. The observable planets have effect on us. Astrology is all about that particular effect, right? So if the planets are in a certain position when I'm born, it means that internally I have certain qualities in the same relationship. And then when the planets change their position, I can take advantage of that using my own particular planetary configuration and make things happen for me or against somebody else or for somebody else. So that's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but it got more and more sophisticated when Kabbalah itself began introduced into the Western mindset, where the words are actually numbers and numbers are actually words. And in a sense, that sounds very superstitious to some people, but to my way of thinking, this was a way of trying to order reality in a certain way, of seeing the connections where people would not see them necessarily, that there's a numerical correspondence to what we say. Our speech has mathematics to it. And besides the speech and the numbers, then there are patterns. There are designs of rearranging the numbers, rearranging the patterns to create different realities. So those correspondences then became a major thing. So you had people drawing up whole lists of the planets and herbs and metals and positions and things that you would say are directions in space and on to completely articulate your world that was completely articulated like a skeleton, or articulated skeleton, everything connected to everything else somehow. And once you understood that image, that picture, any change you made anywhere would have a ripple effect on the whole. And it took years to understand that because you couldn't just like a bull in a china shop start doing stuff. You never know what the effect was really going to be. So then you would have the sorcerer's apprentice idea, right? So there's that opening scene of Fantasia with Mickey Mouse and the brooms and the buckets and the water and everything else is going crazy. That would be somebody who's not really particularly trained in the doctrine of correspondences, but is aware that it exists and can have power over them, just cannot control it, cannot predict it. So yeah, that doctrine of correspondences, I think, is pervasive. The idea behind it is pervasive. whether or not you believe in the mystical thing itself, the idea behind the doctrine of correspondences is there. It's still there in our physics. We're still looking for that magic key. We're still looking for that connection between the Planck scale and consciousness, for instance, the microtubule effect that I write about in Sinister Forces, I think also in Volume 3. So the idea that there is a point at which in our brain we had access to consciousness itself, and it just depends upon this very small thing called a microtubule vibrating at the Planck scale in our brains that is actually attached then to the rest of the quantum world. So we're still looking for these things. We still believe they exist, and probably for good reason.
Yeah.
Just one example. I know I don't want to run out of time, but just one example that's always fascinated me is there are these ancient images of double helixes, right? And there's an ancient Chinese thing. I think we duplicated in Secret Machines, I think in book 2, in Man. There's a picture, it's very old, it's hundreds of years old, a Chinese diagram of the mother and father of creation. And they're humanoid down to their waist, but then from their waist on, they're serpents. And the serpents entwine in a perfect double helix. And this is supposed to be the parents of creation, the parents of all human beings, of all creation, this mother, this father, and a double helix. The double helix doesn't exist in nature, right? Helixes do.
Right.
But the double helix does not accept in the DNA molecule. And we didn't know about that until the mid-20th century. And yet you can go all over the world and find the twin serpents represented as a caduceus. It's in the scepter of the Eastern Orthodox bishops, for instance. It's all over the place. It's this famous, pervasive symbol. And it always made me think, is it because we're all composed of that we are obsessively drawing it? Because it's in every cell of our body, right? It's why we're here. And we didn't know it existed until we got the electron microscopes and all the other stuff that happened with Watson and Crick and all the rest. So it was there. We knew it was there. We kept drawing it. If something was trying to tell us something, it was trying to tell us something. And is that where we start to develop this idea of the doctrine of correspondences? Something very small and yet having this huge impact. And if you just arranged it the right way, like the amino acids on your double helix, you would get certain specific results.
Okay. Yes, that's very good. Listen, we're running out of time here, but there's so much more I want to get to. Let me jump from Disney synchronicities and correspondences to Charles Manson and programmed assassins. Time Rider, you have a group of characters, A.J., that are basically, they seem to be genetically programmed to be the best assassins the money can buy, and off they go. And then Peter, in book 3, you mentioned Charles Manson prominently, and the idea of programmed assassins. Why does the Charles Manson story, Peter, and then A.J., you can jump into, have such a primary role in book 3? And does Manson actually represent a symbol of some sort in American culture, do you think?
Well, for me, he did. I know for most people this would not necessarily make any sense, but for me, he did because of one phrase. A writer called Ed Sanders, right? Very famous guy back in the Beat era and all of that. Ed Sanders had written a book on the Manson family. And there was one sentence that had stood out at me, and he said, if the Pentagon ever formulated the Manson secret, the world would be in trouble. Right?
Right.
And I thought, how profound, not necessarily profound even, but it really inspired a whole strain of thought. And the strain of thought was, well, what if they did? What if they did discover the Manson secret? What was the Manson secret? And wasn't the Manson secret this ability of this little nebbishy guy, right? This little nebbishy guy to control all of these people, get them to do what he wanted to do, and send them out to commit murder. And because Manson brings in all these other things that you can't escape. Manson killed who? He killed Sharon Tate, who was 9 months pregnant, and everybody living in the house was Sharon Tate. Sharon Tate was married to Roman Polanski. Polanski had directed Rosemary's Baby, for Christ's sake, right? And then in 1968, in June 68, Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate have dinner with John Frankenheimer, the director who directed The Manchurian Candidate, the first one with Frank Sinatra and Angela Lansbury. That leaves me another whole bunch of stuff. So anyway, so he directed that, right? That was dinner that night, and their guest of honor was Bobby Kennedy. And he leaves that dinner and he goes out and he's assassinated, right? And it was Polanski and Tate and Frankenheimer who were at dinner with Polanski and with Bobby Kennedy. So, okay, your mind starts racing on these connections, right? These are connections that are very suspicious. But I've read a lot worse in the deep state literature of people making connections of stuff that just doesn't make any freaking sense at all. But in this case, it was provocative. So I said, let me look at the Manson thing. Let me look at that even deeper. What was really going on? What happened to Charlie Manson in Ashland, Kentucky when he was a kid growing up?
Right.
That's a whole other story. And then what happened to him at Terminal Island? And he was being audited as a Scientologist in one place. And then he gave an interview to the Process Church of the Final Judgment, this really weird group that was associated with all kinds of stuff. They had interviews with Charlie Manson and with Marianne Faithfull, right?
Oh, so yeah, Mary, you remember that.
Yeah, of all people. So Marianne Faithfull, that led me down another rabbit hole. So Manson actually was a kind of a key to a lot of 60s American weirdness, including political assassinations, including murder, including mass murder, including occultism, witchcraft, all this other stuff, cults of different kinds. The Manson family was the key to it. The whole Manson experience was the key to it. And Ed Sanders, I think, was right. To the extent he could be right about this, he said, if the Pentagon ever formulated it. This was the ability of a nebbishy kind of guy to go around and to know human nature well enough to be able to pull strings and to get people to do things they wouldn't ordinarily do, or maybe that they would ordinarily do. He just identified the people who would. And isn't that the job of an intelligence agency with a knock overseas somewhere trying to manipulate situations? I don't know. That's why I did, make a long story short.
Peter, A.J., a central plot line in Time Rider, and certainly in book 3 of Sinister Forces, there's great discussion about the Kennedy assassination. It's a driving theme in Time Rider to a certain extent. And Peter, you spent an enormous amount of time talking about it in that and Sinister Forces. And Peter, seeing the assassination as a prime example of how the purpose of many acts, assassinations, massacres, cults, is to destabilize, disorient, and reprogram society. And in Time Rider, even this event is at the center of a plan to do that, destabilize society, and in order to reprogram history. And also, there are a couple characters in Sinister Forces, Peter, that you focus on: Guy Bannister, David Ferry, and of course, the inevitable Lee Harvey Oswald. They come up in both. They come up in Time Rider, and they certainly come up in Sinister Forces. Can both of you just talk about it in general as much as you want to talk about that, and particularly the oddness, Peter, of these characters in the Kennedy assassinations, and then later on in A.J., how you saw that also from Peter's work and how you incorporated that, and was it too difficult, or was it difficult to incorporate that into your novel? Peter, you want to go ahead?
Okay. The Kennedy assassination, of course, is this major touchstone. If you're a conspiracy theorist, that's where you start. It's with the Kennedy assassination, right? I was not that interested in trying to promote one theory over another because I really didn't have one. I saw a lot of the evidence from all different places. I didn't know how reliable some of it was. And I realized that how much of this would hold up in a court of law. So I was going through it and trying to understand it because I remember really clearly the day that Kennedy was shot, like everybody who was our age, I guess, remembers it. So I started going through the Warren Commission report, not the summary, the Warren Commission report, right? So that's volume after volume. And I'm trying to find people that I think might have something more interesting to say. And I'm reading the volume of the interrogation of Ruth Paine. Now, Ruth Paine lived in Texas. She allowed Lee Harvey Oswald and his wife and their kids to live there from time to time. She was the person that was responsible for getting Lee his job at the Texas School Book Depository. She wanted to learn Russian. This was the story that she told people. And so she loved having these Russian-speaking people in her house so she could practice her Russian. She was a Quaker, all these other things.
And Peter, you realize she just died, right? A couple of days ago.
She died?
Yeah, Ruth Paine passed away.
Really?
I think I saw it in the New York Times, yeah. And I'll leave it at that. I didn't mean to interrupt you, yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. I met her.
Yes.
It's a long story, but I'll leave that for some other time. But at any rate, so yeah, Ruth Paine. So I'm reading, her testimony. And at one point, she starts talking about going up to visit her in-laws in Pennsylvania. And she's cut off immediately by Alan Dulles with some ridiculous remark about something. Just as she's getting into this, she had Lee Oswald in her house. She had Marina Oswald in her house. She's going up to visit her in-laws in the summer of 1963. And of course, she would talk about having a Russian defector in her house. And he was married to what? The niece of a colonel in Russian military intelligence. Hello. So, and who are her in-laws, right? Her in-laws is Arthur Young and Ruth Forbes Payne Young, right? Another Ruth Payne, basically. So there's Arthur Young, who was one of the original members, as A.J. knows because he knew the name right away, of the Nine. Puharich's Nine was Arthur Young and his wife, Ruth. And Arthur Young had been the inventor of the Bell helicopter during World War II. And after World War II, he decided to abandon this kind of work and devote himself entirely to the supernatural. So he's doing paranormal research and everything else. And Ruth Forbes Payne Young was Forbes, right? And a Payne and a Young. She was all of these things. And blue blood American aristocracy as far back as you can go. Special friend of Alan Dulles's mistress. And I could just see Alan Dulles's head exploding, right? I do not want Ruth Payne to start talking about this shit, right? So he heads her off at the pass. We never hear about this again. And I start pulling at that thread and pulling at that thread. And that's when the whole Puharich thing comes out and the Nine and all the rest of it. It's because they tried to shut up Ruth Payne during the investigation of the assassination. And what's Alan Dulles doing running the assassination investigation anyway, after Kennedy fired him because of Bay of Pigs? So anyway, so yes, the Nine then becomes critical because the Nine are now implicated long distance in the assassination. Ruth Payne went from Texas to visit Arthur Young. She told Arthur Young, as we find out later, she told the Youngs about Oswald, about all of this. And when the assassination happened, they freaked out and they told Ruth to shut the fuck up. Do not tell anybody about this. Do not admit this. Say nothing to anyone, right? But it was Ruth who basically got Oswald's locked away because she knew the rifle was there. She had a diary. She had all this other evidence. This Quaker woman who was completely nonviolent, who was like totally ACLU, would not even get the guy a lawyer after he asked her to get me a lawyer, and she didn't do it, right? Her estranged husband was Arthur Young's son-in-law, and he worked at Bell Aerospace, right? So, I mean, the mountain of stuff that happened because of this. So all these coincidences, and then you throw in Guy Bannister to all of this, and Guy Bannister's a character in Time Rider. And here's Bannister with a hell of a pedigree, because that made my head explode as well. When I realized that Guy Bannister, the famous guy in New Orleans who ran that detective agency, made famous by the Kevin Costner movie, JFK, this guy, his job in 1947, working for J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI, was investigating UFO sightings in the Pacific Northwest. So we're talking Maury Island, we're talking all the sightings up there, the Kenneth Arnold famous flying saucer site. He's just investigating this. He's like a man in black. He's going around, getting documents, getting testimony, and then sending these urgent telexes, which were telegrams, which if any guys know, it's a form of email that existed.
Right. Yeah.
Was sending all this back to Hoover, directly to Hoover's desk, because Hoover wanted to be apprised immediately on what they were calling SM-X, which was Special Mission X. It was the X files, right? So all of this UFO stuff was going back by Bannister in 1947, and then in 1967, I mean, he's being investigated. He's been dead by then. He died in 63 or 64, Bannister. But the Garrison was investigating him because of his possible role in the assassination. So UFOs and then the assassination. And then the guy he was investigating, Fred Krisman at Maury Island, shows up in the assassination, being subpoenaed by Garrison's people for his knowledge of the assassination. You got the UFO people on one side, you got the weird bishops on the other side. Oswald never had a chance, man.
AJ, what do you make of all this?
Well, see, the great thing about working with something like this based on Peter's stuff is that so much of the legwork has already been done. If I was early in my career, as you mentioned before, I started off as a sort of mystery thriller writer, and I was doing a lot of archaeological stuff. And so the starting point of most of my books was a ton of research, looking for cool, interesting, surprising little things that might generate other connections and other stories. So there's an odd synchronicity here, right? Because it's not an accident that we've been paired together, I think. The great thing about doing something like this is that, as you can hear, Peter's already done the work. He spotted the stars and aligned the constellations. So my job then is to come in and try to tell a coherent story that draws on all this stuff. And there's a massive volume of material. And when Tom first started talking to me about it, and he's like, we're going to center on the Kennedy assassination. And I was like, well, hasn't everything been said about the Kennedy assassination at this point? And I think partly as a result, A, no, and B, the material that I was finding in Peter's work set me off on various rabbit holes of my own. And the process then becomes about what you're not going to include, right? If you're going to maintain a sense of some narrative coherence, that I can't do everything. I couldn't do Manson. I could do Manson-like figures, but I couldn't include that and keep the story on the rails. So, and I think as the story got bigger, in some ways, the Kennedy stuff got less central. It became more of an indicator than it was a linchpin, if that makes sense. And so maybe there'll be more of these novels, in which case we may explore more of the stuff. I don't know. But certainly that was my way of thinking about it, that I didn't want to do another Stephen King novel about JFK. I didn't want to do a retread of the Oliver Stone movie. I wanted it to be ultimately about other things and use the core issues and connections around the assassination to ask a larger question and to bring in other kinds of incidents and events from history and point towards a different kind of future.
Well, we're running out of time, and there were two things I wanted to get into, because both of your books, Sinister Forces in much greater detail and in historical look, and then in Time Rider also, the whole concept of the Kennedy assassination and some of the characters from Sinister Forces play prominent roles also in Time Rider. I don't think we're going to have time for that, because I do want to ask you one final question, but Sinister Forces is this absolutely superb trilogy, and I promise people you will absolutely enjoy reading it as much as you will enjoy reading A.J.'s book, Time Rider, which will be coming out, I think, sometime in mid-October. But A.J.
October 7th, I believe.
October 7th? Okay. But let me ask one final question for both of you. And what's a takeaway for your readers about the ideas of power and ritual and hidden influence in America today? What do you want to get across? What were you trying to get across in Sinister Forces in the end, Peter, if you got to sum it up? And then A.J., also, with your novel was fascinating, but I didn't read it as much as entertainment as I read it almost as a lesson and an idea. And I thought it was rather profound. So, Peter, you want to go first? And then.
Yeah, it's hard to encapsulate everything. I wanted people to look. I just wanted people to look at these connections, to look at these things, and to ask themselves, what's going on here? What is really going on here? I didn't want to give, as you said, I don't want to give answers. I don't have any. I don't have a grand final word that this all leads to this. I'm not ideological that way. I am as much in the air about some of this and in space about it as anybody else. The difference is I'm looking at all of this other stuff and I'm saying this is evidence. These are clues at the scene of the crime. How do we analyze this crime scene now? And I realize I don't have all the tools to do that. It takes everybody's cooperation to do that. Everybody has an angle on it, as we do with the UFO phenomenon. Right. Everybody has a piece of it. We all have a piece of the story. We just have to contribute our pieces and use some critical thinking, but at the same time be open to other ideas and other possibilities of connection.
Okay. A.J.?
Yeah, I would say something similar. I think for me as a novelist, the journey is as important as the destination, right? That how we get there, the thing that keeps making you turn the pages is going to be more than simply an answer on the last page, right? This is the danger of writing mystery novels, right? Where the whole thing hinges on the reveal at the end. Generally, for most readers, that's not a satisfying experience. There's got to be stuff going along the way that keeps you interested, keeps you engaged. And so that's part of my purpose. But I think in terms of an observation, or I hesitate to use a term like message, but yeah, to reinforce what Peter says, to look, to pay attention, to be alert to what is happening and has happened and might happen, to see the connections between things and the corner that paints us into. And where necessary, to resist.
Beautifully said, both of you. Thank you so much. Well, sadly, we're coming to a close. There were probably half a dozen questions I wanted to ask, and I had extra questions I wanted to ask if we had time, but we're just not going to. Maybe we can do this again soon. So we're going to have to wrap up this 16th session of TTS Talks. Peter and AJ, thank you again for spending time with us today, and I hope we can chat again with both of you soon. All the books we discussed today are available online and in most bookstores. To find more information about AJ and Peter, check out their websites, www.ajhartley.net, peterlavenda.com, and peterlavenda.substack.com. And a special thanks to our producers, AC Catrone, Carrie DeLong, and Lisa Clifford for all their help and guidance, without whom this podcast would not be possible. And a special shout out to Joe Brisbois, who provided much welcome insights for this podcast to me. So all of the Secret Machines books are available at tothestars.media. You can stay up to date with TTS by finding us on social media, Instagram at tothestars.media, and just here, and Twitter at tothestars.media, and Facebook at tothestars Inc. And thanks for tuning into TTS Talks. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the podcast, rate and review us over at Apple Podcasts, and we will catch you next time for another TTS Talks. Thank you very much.